People forget that the quietest ones often carry the heaviest flags. Let us know in the comment section below, what would you have done if you witnessed this moment? Lucas Witherspoon stood just inside the wrought iron gates of the museum plaza, hands behind his back, spine ramrod straight like it had been trained to be over half a century ago. His faded olive field jacket hung loosely on his narrow frame, the color bleached by sun and time, patches stitched and restitched by the same hands that once held wounded brothers through nights that never seemed to end. The unit pin and eagle-clutching arrows still gleamed, somehow resisting age, even when everything else had not. His cap, a battered relic from his first tour in Korea, cast a slight shadow over his brow, but it did nothing to hide the steel in his eyes. He wasn't lost, he wasn't confused, he knew exactly where he was supposed to be. Lucas had arrived hours early. He'd taken 3 buses from his home in West Cedar. It wasn't easy. His right knee, the one shattered by shrapnel outside Quezon, reminded him of its history with every step. Still, he moved forward, his gait measured but proud, approaching the entrance of the National Veterans Museum with the quiet reverence of a man visiting a gravesite. And then there was the voice. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your government-issued ID." The tone wasn't polite. It was clipped, bureaucratic, laced with the unmistakable smugness of a man who didn't know and didn't care who stood in front of him. The security guard, Caleb Morgan, 26 years old, sharp jawline, sunglasses he didn't need, and a badge he wore like it made him king, didn't look up from his clipboard. Lucas reached into his pocket and slowly pulled out an old wallet. "I got my VA card right here," he said quietly. Caleb barely glanced. "Not a federal ID. VA cards don't count. You'll need a current driver's license or passport to enter, otherwise I can't let you through." Lucas blinked slowly. "I don't drive anymore. Don't travel either. My license expired years ago." Caleb shrugged. "Then I guess you're not getting in." Something tightened in the air. Not tension. Humiliation. But not from Lucas. A woman nearby in a museum polo shirt, Kendra Alvarez, paused in her walk and turned. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the interaction. She'd seen Caleb pull this before, but today something felt different. Today she didn't see just a man being denied. She saw a ritual being desecrated. "Hey, Caleb," she called out, walking over. "We're supposed to let veterans in free today. Did you check his credentials?" Caleb didn't budge. "No ID, no entry. Museum policy." Kendra frowned. "He's wearing a bronze star." "I'm not going by his outfit," Caleb replied flatly, gesturing toward Lucas's jacket. "For all we know, he picked that up at a thrift store." The words, once said, sat there like a spilled drink across a sacred document. Lucas didn't speak. He just stood still, letting the insult settle into his chest like a second wound. His hands clenched behind his back, but his face remained unreadable. Kendra's face flushed. "That man's name is Lucas Witherspoon," she said, stepping closer to Caleb, her voice lowered now. 2 tours in Korea, 2 in Vietnam. He was in Da Nang when your dad was still in diapers. General Donovan Pierce mentioned him in his book. He called him the man who carried me to the medevac. You might want to read more and judge less." Caleb scoffed. "Yeah, well, unless the general's here to say that in person, he's not coming in." Behind them, the crowd was starting to shift. A few other early arrivals for the Pearl Harbor Remembrance event had stopped. One man whispered to his wife. Another woman held her phone, recording discreetly. Lucas, still silent, turned to walk away. He didn't say a word. He didn't argue. He just walked, slower this time, like something had been taken from him that had nothing to do with age. The sound of his boots scraping the concrete was the only goodbye. By the time Lucas Witherspoon reached the sidewalk bench across the street from the museum, he was already forgotten by the man who denied him. But Lucas wasn't thinking about that. He sat slowly, Carefully, lowering himself as if lowering a flag, with both hands resting on his cane, he looked ahead, watching guests begin to arrive for the ceremony. Young soldiers in dress blues, retired officers with perfect posture, families holding framed photos of the fallen. He'd been one of them once, a face in the uniformed crowd. Across the plaza, Kendra Alvarez leaned against the side entrance, arms crossed, jaw tight, her stomach twisted in a way that felt like shame, someone else's shame, but shame nonetheless. She kept glancing toward the sidewalk, toward that lone figure on the bench, whose presence had gone from invisible to monumental in just a few minutes. She checked her watch. The general would arrive soon. Inside, preparations for the Pearl Harbor Remembrance Day ceremony moved forward. Flags were unfurled, rows of chairs were set. A podium stood tall in the museum courtyard, its brass plaque shining in the morning light. But no one outside seemed to notice Lucas. Not the reporters unpacking their tripods, not the politicians rehearsing their speeches, not the attendees with crisp collars and crisper smiles. They passed him like they passed bus stops, without looking, without seeing. A little boy, no older than 10, tugged on his father's sleeve. "Dad, who's that man sitting over there?" The father glanced, indifferent, just some guy, probably waiting for the bus. Lucas heard it, he heard all of it. But he didn't respond, didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket and removed a folded piece of yellowing paper. Creased, fragile, kept safe all these years. It was a telegram, dated April 1966. His mother had kept it, and when she passed, he had folded it into his wallet like a scripture. Private First Class Lucas Witherspoon distinguished himself by exceptional bravery. He read it silently, lips moving just a little. Then he tucked it away again, gently. Back across the courtyard, General Donovan Pierce's black SUV rolled up to the edge of the gated lane. The driver stepped out, crisp and precise, and opened the door. Out stepped the general. Tall, composed, polished medals and polished shoes. Pierce was the kind of man who made silence fall without raising his voice. He nodded to the few saluting officers nearby, gave a quick nod to the press, and then looked past the entrance, past the red carpet, past the security checkpoint, and saw the old man on the bench. He stopped walking. For a long second he just stood there, eyes narrowing. His aide leaned in. "General, your seat's being held up front." But Pierce didn't move. Kendra was already moving, hurrying down the steps, past the display banners and the flapping flags. She moved like someone who had been holding a truth too long. "General Pierce?" she called gently. He turned to her with recognition. "You're Kendra Alvarez, correct? EOD, Afghanistan?" "Yes, sir." She motioned toward the bench across the street. "That's Lucas Witherspoon." Pierce didn't respond. He was already walking. The press noticed now. Cameras pivoted, heads turned. The general wasn't going inside. He was crossing the street. Each step he took drew more attention. Murmurs spread across the courtyard like ripples in still water. And when he reached the bench, Lucas didn't stand. He just looked up slowly, like a man waking from a long dream. "Lucas," the general said, voice catching for the briefest moment. "You old son of a gun." Lucas squinted. "Donovan? You got older. And shinier." The general chuckled. "And you got forgotten, apparently." Lucas waved it off. "Doesn't matter." "It does." The general sat down beside him, full dress uniform and all. "What the hell happened?" Lucas told him, not with bitterness, not with outrage, just the facts. Pierce listened, every word sinking in like a nail driven deeper. And then, without saying another word, he stood, pulled out his phone and made a call. His tone was calm, but the way he said, "I want the ceremony paused until I say otherwise," made the air shift again. The event organizers were confused, staff were scrambling. Caleb Morgan, still stationed at the entrance, began to realize something was wrong. Very wrong. A full 4-star general had walked away from the ceremony. The murmurs turned into whispers, whispers into talk, talk into outrage. Within minutes, Kendra came back across the street with another staffer, breathless. "General, the press is asking questions, the congressman's confused, the attendees are—" "Let them be confused," Pierce said. "They should be. Now bring Mr. Witherspoon inside, or cancel the whole damn thing." Lucas started to rise, but winced. Without hesitation, the general offered his arm. Lucas took it, not because he needed help standing, but because some things you do for each other, not for necessity, but for honor. As they walked back toward the museum gates, silence spread across the courtyard like fog. And then, as if some unspoken chord had been struck, one man in uniform stood. Then another held another. By the time Lucas Witherspoon passed through the crowd, the entire assembly was on its feet. Not a single word was spoken, because sometimes silence is louder than applause. Lucas Witherspoon didn't walk through the crowd like a guest. He moved like a man being returned to the soil of his past, quiet, solemn, and heavy with the knowledge that respect, once lost, isn't easily reclaimed. But something was different now. There was no resistance, no checkpoint. No one dared raise a clipboard or question the man who walked beside a 4-star general. Each footstep echoed louder than the last as they crossed the plaza and re-entered the courtyard, where the seats were still full, but no one had dared sit back down. Men and women who'd never known Lucas, who couldn't name a single campaign he'd fought in, stood in reverent silence. Not because of his uniform, not even because of the general beside him. They stood because of the way he carried himself, weathered but unbroken. Inside the museum's side wing, where the honored guests were meant to wait before the ceremony, murmurs filled the marble corridor. Aides scurried about trying to adjust seating charts. The congressman from Delaware checked his watch twice, already annoyed that his opening remarks had been delayed. But the attention shifted the moment General Pierce opened the door. "Everyone," the general said without raising his voice, "this is Lucas Witherspoon." A few nodded politely, still unaware. Others glanced at his worn jacket, confused by the absence of shine or rank. Then Pierce turned, gestured to a display on the wall behind the reception area, and walked toward it. A glass case held a rusted helmet, a faded journal, and a photograph of 6 men standing in front of a downed Huey helicopter. "Take a good look," the general said. "Third from the left. That's Lucas. That was 66. Central Highlands." The room grew still. "This day," he continued, pointing to the journal, "he pulled me out from under burning wreckage while 2 of those men bled out. I still don't know how he did it. I was screaming. He was calm. He carried me over a mile through jungle thick with shrapnel and lead. I would not be standing here if not for him." The silence broke with a slow, uncertain clap from one man in a wheelchair, then another and another, until the room filled with applause. Not showy, not forced, but real. Lucas didn't smile. He simply nodded once, deeply, like a man accepting a salute. Then came the moment he hadn't expected. "Lucas," Pierce said gently, "would you say a few words?" Lucas hesitated. He hadn't spoken to a crowd since his last deployment briefing in '71. But then he stepped forward. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "I didn't come here for speeches. I didn't come here for cameras. I came because I knew some of the names on that wall out there. Boys I trained with, fished with, argued with, watched die." He paused, adjusting the brim of his cap. "I didn't come here to be let in. I came here because I never really left." A few in the room shifted, eyes glistening. Lucas looked around. "Some of us came home, but we never arrived. Understand? The uniform doesn't protect you after. The medals don't pay your rent. The wars don't end just 'cause you crossed a state line." He turned to Caleb Morgan, who had now been ushered awkwardly into the room at Kendra's insistence. The young man stood stiffly at the back, eyes flicking between the general and the veteran he'd dismissed hours ago. Lucas didn't call him out, didn't shame him. He simply said, "Son, you didn't see me. But I hope you do now. Not just me. All of us. Even the ones still sitting outside places like this, wondering if they'll ever be welcome again." Caleb lowered his eyes. Lucas turned back to the general. "That's all I have to say." And that's when something happened that Lucas would never forget. The general removed one of his own medals from his chest, his Distinguished Service Cross, and placed it in Lucas's hands. "You earned this before I ever did," he said. Lucas stared at it. "This isn't mine." "It is now," the general said, "because it carries your story with it." The press had caught everything by then. Flash bulbs went off, questions were shouted, but no one answered them. Because what mattered had already been said. That afternoon, they didn't restart the ceremony. They restructured it. Lucas was brought on stage, not as a guest, but as the keynote speaker. He didn't read from a script. He didn't prepare remarks. He just told stories. Stories about the first time he flew in a chopper and thought it would fall apart. About the way one guy used to whistle jazz standards before patrol. About the last letter his best friend ever sent home. And people listened, not just politely, but completely. Even the kids. Even the politicians. Even the guard. By the time Lucas Witherspoon finished speaking, the clouds had parted. It wasn't poetic, just weather, but it felt like something bigger had shifted too. People didn't rush to leave once he stepped down from the stage. They lingered, as if reluctant to return to a world that had just hours ago refused to see him. Lucas didn't stay on stage. He preferred the edge of the crowd, where a younger man could shake his hand without cameras hovering. The lines were long. Veterans, civilians, young officers, museum staff. They all came with something different in their faces. Some came with respect, others with guilt, but most, he noticed, came with something gentler than either: recognition. One woman, maybe in her 50s, hugged him tight. "My father served in Korea. He never talked about it. Seeing you today, I feel like I saw a piece of him." Lucas simply said, "Thank you for saying that," and kept her hand in his for a second longer than was necessary. Behind him, General Pierce stood near the museum's central arch, arms crossed, watching it all unfold. He hadn't gone back to his reserved seat. He hadn't even taken his jacket off, despite the warmth creeping into the late morning air. He just stood still, his presence alone holding the chaos of the event together. The congressman, now thoroughly sidelined, was finally beginning to understand the optics. His assistant whispered that they should reintroduce Lucas in next year's Veterans Initiative. "Too late," the congressman muttered. "He doesn't need us now. We need him." The crowd began to move toward the museum's memorial wall, the polished stone one bearing names from every war since the Revolution. Families brought wreaths. Soldiers placed challenge coins and photographs. Children traced names with tiny fingers. Lucas didn't join the line. He waited until the rush faded, then walked slowly to the wall, stopping when he reached panel 22. His hands trembled as he traced one particular name: Tommy D. Witherspoon. Younger brother, 2 years younger, died in '68 in the Ai Drang Valley. Lucas had carried that name longer than anyone else had. "Brought you back here," he whispered. "Took me long enough." Someone behind him spoke quietly. "We've been waiting, Mr. Witherspoon." Lucas turned. It was Kendra. She stood there with 3 other veterans, 1 Marine, 1 Air Force, and 1 Navy. All of them wore a pin that Lucas immediately recognized. Not unit insignia, not rank, but the small, brushed silver badge of a museum board advisor. Kendra smiled. "They are making changes, real ones. No more ID rejections for veterans. New protocols, mandatory training, and something else." The Navy vet stepped forward and handed him a small folder. Inside was a certificate. At the top, in bold script, "Honorary Lifetime Ambassador. National Veterans Museum. Lucas blinked. Would have been easier to just give you a lanyard, the Marine said with a grin, but the board wanted this to mean something. Lucas looked down at the certificate for a long moment. I didn't come here for this. We know, Kendra said. That's exactly why you deserve it. Back at the main tent, a staffer interrupted General Pierce to inform him that the local press wanted a formal statement. Harris shook his head. No need. Sir, Pierce pointed toward Lucas, who was now surrounded by a small crowd of kids asking about his cap. That's the statement. The general didn't go back on stage. He joined Lucas instead. Together they knelt in front of the wall, each placing a hand on a different name. Somewhere nearby, a bugler began to play taps. The sound was soft, sincere, and carried across the plaza like smoke from a sacred fire. Afterward, when the chairs were being folded and the podium was disassembled, Lucas sat again on that same bench across the street, the one where it all started. He removed his cap and held it in his lap. He wasn't tired, not exactly, just full, weighted down by something that, for the first time in years, didn't feel like pain. Caleb Morgan approached slowly. Lucas didn't acknowledge him at first. The young man stood beside the bench, then finally spoke. Sir, I was wrong. All of it. Lucas turned his head slightly. I know. I didn't see you, Caleb said, eyes down. But I do now, and I'm sorry. Lucas studied him for a moment, then nodded once. You'll see more, once you know what to look for. Caleb looked unsure, like he wanted to say more, but didn't know how. Lucas offered a gesture instead. He patted the bench beside him. Caleb sat. For several long minutes they said nothing. They just watched as the last of the guests filtered away, and the museum doors closed behind the final family. You ever serve? Lucas asked finally. No, sir. Lucas nodded. Then maybe it's your job to remember us, and not forget the ones who can't walk through those gates anymore. Caleb swallowed hard. Yes, sir. At that moment a breeze stirred the flags around the plaza. The folded chairs clinked as staff packed them into racks. The sound of boots on pavement faded, and in that silence something had shifted. Lucas Witherspoon didn't need a parade. He didn't need a statue or a national holiday. He just needed to be seen. And now, finally, he was